joining us. And I hope, Governor Noem, that you didn't suffer too much anxiety taking that well too familiar commute back to Washington.
No, no, a little bit of PTSD, but not too bad.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that I like to always paraphrase is Dwight Eisenhower when he says, and we've listened from the disinformation and lack of information from, unfortunately, my colleagues on the other side. Dwight Eisenhower said that farming looks very easy when you use a pencil for a plow and you live 1,000 miles away from a cornfield. Mm-hmm. And that is exactly the problem that we run into in this body on a daily basis. There are too many people that are making decisions about the land management in our part of the world that they are not familiar with at all. And unfortunately, we have some people making those decisions, such as a director of BLM who is a known collaborator with eco-terrorists, and a Secretary of Interior who won't provide documents about her daughter's lobbying efforts with the Department of Interior and BLM. That certainly doesn't help matters. Sadly, it's critically important for us to pass this bill and hold this hearing so that we, the people that are impacted the most by it, can actually get accurate information about the impact of the rule from the people that are going to be hit by it the most. Mm-hmm. As we've discussed several times already this morning, BLM is not going out and holding these hearings in the areas that are going to be hit. We have requested the state of Montana to have a hearing in the state when we have nearly 40% of our state that is federal public lands, and we can't even accomplish that. We watch the administration, this one, time and again, try to pass or get around laws, okay, to bypass or get around those laws by passing rules that completely contradict them, thereby eliminating congressional participation, congressional representation from the people that we represent as their extension, and public votes, quite frankly. And so they believe that they could do that. Unfortunately, we've seen time again the Supreme Court side with us and say, no, the agencies are going outside of their bounds. So that all being said, Governor Gordon, Governor Noem, did the BLM ever consult with you, your office, or the impacted agencies in your state before the promulgation of this rule?
Mr. Chairman, Congressman Rosenthal, no. There was some indication that you could have an information-only kind of opportunity. We certainly, I think the hearing was held, not a hearing, it was an information-only sort of briefing that was held in Denver. You could only kind of view it, but you couldn't participate, you couldn't have a hearing, you could not talk about what the rule would mean. And the fact, and I think the good governor from South Dakota mentioned it, the fact that they're ignoring, normal NEPA process on something this devastating is just a complete abrogation of FLPMA.
Governor Noem, did the administration meet with you before they promulgated this rule?
No, there was no input or even consideration for our office, no notification or consultation.
Okay, so do either of you believe that, as I do, that this contradicts the Taylor Grazing Act, which is law, which prioritizes grazing, food production for our nation?
Yes.
Yes.
Correct.
As a rancher yourself, how does this conservation and management currently factor in to your typical operation? So I know that in Montana, most of our public lands are checkerboarded, and everybody seems to be the same way. So how is this going to impact the typical operation, conservation and or management practices for a local rancher farmer in your state?
Well, for us in particular, ranchers look at every analysis of how they utilize land on how it maintains that land because they recognize it'll need to be utilized in the future. These 10-year leases for permits to access BLM land, they want to continue to get them. They're not interested in a short-term engagement and partnership with BLM. They want to be good stewards, so they're eligible for those leases in the future. Myself as a rancher, looked at my land and utilized rotational grazing to get the most out of that land and leave it in the best shape at all times. And to go forward with a proposed rule like this and say that what we're doing today isn't working and ignoring what's happening on the ground, I think is extremely arrogant, perhaps naive, especially in the fact that when you look at the rule and read it, in fact, the more times I read it, the more offended I was, because it lacks any scientific data or analysis that what we're doing today is not providing conservation and efforts, and that it isn't being a good stewards of the land, but also it doesn't give you any basis for why they're proposing these changes, and that it will actually better our environment, that it'll leave us in better shape. So, this is, it's very clear what their agenda is when you don't use any kind of data to back up the need for changes, have no analysis for the economic impact it'll have. You ignore federal law, you overwhelm our state's authority and rights with it, with what you're proposing as well, and then take constitutional authority that should be only given to Congress. This rule has done all of those, and I want to remind all of you of your responsibility here at this committee. It is to protect the United States of America. And what they are undermining with just the simple rule in BLM undermines all of those precedents that we've followed that are built on constitutional law in this country. So this is quite literally, and I've seen this so much. I've been in a lot of different roles in my life now. I'm a wife and a mom and a grandma, but I'm also a business person, farmer, rancher. I've served in our legislature. I've been here in Congress and as governor. I've never in my life seen such a short period of time where they have completely destroyed the foundation of this country. And it's not just in the big things that you see and hear about on the TV news at night. It's in rules like this, where they're overstepping their authority through a powerful federal government and undermining us as states, us as governors, and the authority we have to fight for our people and their way of life. There will be business owners, small businesses in my state that will be bankrupt if this proposed rule goes into place. They will have no land for their cattle, nowhere to graze them. They will be out of business. Their cattle are their manufacturing plants, their future, and it will be gone. These timber industries, we have one of the last examples of one that's still functioning, but we lost a mill in the Black Hills, and it was because of the federal government. We've got 2 left. Each of us have, and that's all we've got anymore, and we're gonna fight tooth and nail to keep that too. This rule would destroy our timber industry as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your information and for your passion. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Lamborn. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is an important hearing. Thank you for having it. Governor Noem, I enjoyed serving with you in Congress when you were here. In fact, you were on this same committee for a time, and you did such an excellent job, and I know you're also doing that in your position now in South Dakota. Just last month, BLM Director Tracy Stone Manning testified before this committee, and I asked her at that hearing if the new proposed conservation rule would allow simultaneous land use by ranchers, loggers, and other industries. And she said, quote, "The term of the conservation lease would preclude uses that directly conflict with the underlying conservation lease," unquote. I think that a lot of people here in Washington don't understand the West, or they wouldn't make the kind of rules that they're proposing. I know you had a great answer just now to Representative Rosendale. Is there anything you'd like to add about the impact that this rule, should it ever take effect, would have on BLM land and then hence the people and the economy of the state of South Dakota?
Well, let's remember that BLM was established to produce sustained yield and management practices that were out there for conservation efforts. So in every single practice that we're utilizing on BLM land is built in the mandate to utilize conservation. What they're doing in this rule is putting conservation efforts based on no definition of what those conservation efforts are or what they should be, and placing them above every other use. So that in itself turns the entire mission of BLM on its head. And when you have this much federal land in your districts and in your states, it impacts your economy in ways that the ripple effect is tens of thousands of people, tens of thousands of jobs, and it takes their ability to be producers away from them. For me, it's not just on the economic side of it, it's also what it does to people's spirits and to their ability to want to get up every day and go to work. I'm just a big believer that we've lost our nation's work ethic, and we need to remember why we have one. We have a work ethic because we were created to serve other people, to get up every day. It's better for us physically, mentally, spiritually, and having the ability to go out and work on the land and to help it produce and provide for your family would help our nation as a whole be unified and to accomplish something that keeps our economy stable. We've talked for years about the need for not just one part of this country to be successful, not just one part where people can do well and make higher incomes or where they can be more productive. When you guys have a tough economic recession on the East Coast or on the West Coast, often it's the middle of the country that stabilizes this country.
Thank you. Thank you. I
Our people
appreciate
are
that.
still working.
Thank you. Governor Gordon, you are in the great state of Wyoming, and I admire how it is run. I have a daughter with her family who live there, and I've seen firsthand that it's a very well-run state. During COVID, it was a relief to leave Washington, D.C., where things were locked up so tightly, and be where things are at least halfway normal, such as Wyoming. That was a breath of fresh air. One thing that really frustrates me about the current administration is that they will be deceptive when they say a rule is proposed for one reason when their real objective is another reason. Gas cooktop stoves is one example. They say it's to protect people with asthma. They're just trying to shut down a fossil fuel, and they're not admitting that. They're not being honest. Taking helium off the critical mineral list when it comes from natural gas extraction is another example of that. Do you have suspicions or thoughts or concerns about what the real purpose of BLM's new conservation rule is, and will it have the effect of hurting resource-based industries, including conventional fuels?
Mr. Chairman, Congressman, yes, absolutely. I'm very concerned about the ulterior motives of this. It is to shut down fossil fuel development. And as I've mentioned, one of the things is that our fossil fuel industry is very much invested in conservation. To just segue a little bit to the question that Congressman from Montana mentioned very specifically, our ranch is in core sage-grouse area. People that develop minerals do so with an intent to do the best they can to preserve that bird. In our case, we did a range tour, and it was actually the NRCS that came back and said, we can't provide you with any more resource. You're already doing things so well. That's the way we run our ranch. And this conservation rule, if implemented, would suddenly have somebody in Washington say, oh, you know what, we're going to put this in conservation, you can't graze your cows anymore, when very much the role that our cows play in making that range better would be devastated. Our ranching operation would be devastated. That would be true across the West. And so this rule and everything you see in this, and you've got the same issue in Colorado, everything this administration does is about climate. And so you have tremendous regulations being put in place that are holding back our fossil fuel industry, that are costing Americans dearly in the pocket. We had unprecedented rises in the price of oil and gas. And now we're talking about going off of coal and onto natural gas at a time when we can't get a lease out of this administration. We can't get a permit out of this administration. And for those who aren't familiar with the mineral estate, you know, there's a surface estate and a mineral estate. And the way the federal government shuts down anything that goes anywhere near a federal mineral lease shuts down private industry, shuts down private property. It is devastating.
Thank you. I yield back.
So when his time's expired, the chair now recognizes Mr. Huffman, who wasn't overlooked in the last round of questions, but you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I hate to interrupt this hyper-partisan performance masquerading as a legislative hearing, but on the off chance that there may be a few people watching at home who don't get all of their news and information refracted through the kaleidoscope of right-wing media, I would just like them to know that not every Western state is hyped up on anti-government conspiracy politics. In fact, California opposes H.R. 3397 and thinks it's a good idea to proceed with BLM's public lands rule. I'd just like to enter into the record, if I could, Mr. Chairman, this letter from the California Natural Resources Agency.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So look, not every Western state believes it would be the end of the world to elevate conservation to equal footing with grazing and timber harvesting and mining and other extractive uses. A lot of folks think that this is just good, plain common sense and sensible policy, as do I. We'll talk a little more about that when we get to the next panel with the BLM witness. But for now, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back and allow you to proceed with the regularly scheduled conspiracy politics. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back, and I will remind the gentleman it's an open hearing, and I'm glad you came to represent, you and Mr. Hall are here to represent the minority's view, and I do appreciate our witnesses for being here today. I now recognize the gentlelady from Wyoming, Ms. Hageman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And again, it's so good to see both of you. The voice of Wyoming has been ignored on this topic, so I am deeply grateful for the chance to echo their sentiment of concern and outrage over this proposed rule. According to public comments submitted by the United States Business Administration Office of Advocacy, this proposed rule has unintended consequences that are contrary to the statutory provisions of FLPMA, lacks factual basis, and does not adequately consider the economic impacts of the rule on small businesses. That's how bad this proposed rule is. The SBA under the Biden administration is literally calling out the BLM on how bad the proposal is. Mr. Chairman, I would like to submit the SBA's public comments on this for the record.
Without objection, so it's
American economies can only get a return on our federal lands in much of the West through two things. The first is grazing, and the second is through mineral extraction or logging. The very lifestyle of rural communities is at risk when burdensome regulations like this cripple the businesses that allow these communities to flourish. The revenue provided to the state through mining and agriculture is essential to our lives and our economy. This revenue funds our schools, healthcare, public safety, and other essential services. Wyoming is a strong leader in energy production, agriculture, and outdoor recreation, as Governor Gordon outlined in his testimony. Basically, everything this proposed rule touches is what we in Wyoming are good at. So quite frankly, it's hard not to take this personally. To make matters worse, the BLM won't even come to Wyoming to talk about the proposed rule. Governor Gordon, considering that Wyoming's economy lives and dies on the industries impacted by this rule, why do you think it is that BLM would hold town halls in New Mexico and Colorado, but not Wyoming? Are they avoiding something?
Mr. Chairman, Congresswoman Hageman, it is clear they're avoiding having real testimony on the ground with practitioners of conservation. They're looking for communities where they can find a favorable audience so they can move things forward. The testimony of the gentleman from California I take great umbrage at because
We typically do as well.
As Governor Noem and I have worked with folks across the aisle, this is about conservation and good development, good management, and stewardship of our natural resources. It is not a hyper-partisan issue. Just last year, I signed an agreement with Secretary Vilsack, which recognized that private property has a role in wildlife, healthy wildlife populations. So I take real offense at suggesting that this is somehow conspiracy. This is about keeping people on the land. This is about stewardship. And to suggest that people that are in the oil and gas business or miners somehow don't care about conservation is just wrong-headed.
It's been proven over and over and over and over again. Yet our colleagues on the other side just simply can't get through their head because they like the talking points, as we just saw. A few weeks ago, the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigation had Ms. Garcia Richard from New Mexico attend as the minority witness. And in her written testimony, she said that a state's, quote, ability to generate money for education is directly tied to the health and the productivity of state lands. What I don't understand is what revenue you would generate for your state through a federal conservation lease Governor, will conservation leases generate any funds to local education or to the state in general?
Mr. Chairman, Madam Congressman, no. That money would go to the federal government. And, you know, it's sort of a joke to think that we're going to make it more productive by taking it out of play. We, as you know, and Governor Lujan Grisham and I have both addressed Congress on this fact, our schools are funded by education. Our education is funded by mineral development. The leases and all the ancillary pieces of the economy are funded by activities on federal lands. Taking those out of play would be devastating to our economy.
One of the things that so many people don't understand is that our water development and the way that we manage our resources in the West, even on federal lands, is typically done by private individuals to better the situation for their livestock production, but that also benefits our wildlife. You take cattle off of our federal lands in the West, you're also going to have a substantially negative impact on wildlife because we're not going to be developing the resources that they need to survive. This is going to have incredibly negative, unintended consequences that the people in Washington, D.C. don't understand, and they should not be making policies like this sitting in their air-conditioned office here. With that, I yield back.
Lady yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Duarte, for 5 minutes.
Well, I'm a people in Washington, and I would seek to understand more about what you do. I think it's underappreciated, the 245 million acres in Bureau of Land Management. Looks pretty good to me from the air. I don't see every inch of it by any means mined and developed with gas rigs. Not that those things bother me much when they're done properly and sustainably and effectively by operators that know what they're doing. What does bother me a lot are some of the mismanaged lands in California, the forests that burn, purportedly because of climate change, but from my angle on the kaleidoscope, we've neglected them. We've turned those forests over to the priorities of the conservation groups for a few decades, and now they're burning out of control, and we're getting no value from that. You know, you see some bumper stickers around rural communities that say, graze it, log it, or watch it burn. And I believe we should be grazing it and logging it in California, much like we should be doing in South Dakota and Wyoming. I would invite you, Governor Noem, and then you, Governor Gordon, give us some detail. Talk to us about the things you think about to be effective resource managers on your ranches and how those lead to the, not only the conservation of the resources on your ranches, but how instead of the government coming out with resource conservation monies and paying billions of dollars to have somebody do it for them, for us, you guys do a lot of environmental services for free because, God forbid, we'll try and accept it, you make a few nickels once in a while doing it. Please explain the business of being a ranch owner to us, please.
Well, I would say for most ranchers, thank you, Congressman, for the question. For most ranchers, it's not a business model. It's their family legacy. It's what their fathers did and their grandfathers and grandmothers did, and it's something that they take a lot of pride in. I think probably one of the most devastating things I've ever seen in my entire life was when Winter Storm Atlas hit South Dakota when I served here in Congress, and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of cattle were dead overnight because of something out of ranchers' control. And so to paint the picture that they only care about dollars and cents just simply isn't true. And they make management decisions how best to support that herd, but also how to support that land and how to protect it. They're putting in investments to access water, and they're putting in different resources in order to manage noxious weeds. You could go anywhere in South Dakota and see that the private land and land in cooperation with ranchers is better cared for than much land that would be under a government jurisdiction or at the federal level. What's interesting to me is that if you look at BLM and what their mission is that it specifically is to use the land. It's a land management agency, and it's supposed to consider conservation in every activity that conducts it. When you start prioritizing one over the other, the entire mission of the agency fails. And the way that they're approaching this by declaring this not a major rule completely eliminates any of the scientific facts they would need to even know if this rule is going to work. When the former congressman over here was chatting about conspiracy theories, this whole proposed rule is a conspiracy theory. They are avoiding federal law. They will never do They may not even, under one of their processes they've established in this rule, even require these rules to be listed in the Federal Register anymore. Under the ACEC process, they're taking away all public input, potentially, in how they're going to create intact landscapes, which means the public will have no input, and they can immediately implement it overnight, which is not the authority of BLM. So I'm incredibly surprised by how this rule came forward, because of how it's established, and it's ignoring the long-set precedent that ranchers take every day to manage lands and not asking for their input.
Thank you. That's a great answer. No one understands ranching and government together better than the two of you. We'll give what's left of the last minute to Governor Gordon, if we can, please. But thank you very much.
Well, thank you. On a personal level, when I get up on the ranch, I go out, I look at how the grass is growing. We measure it on a monthly basis. You can go to our website and see our range studies over the last several years. We take our conservation very seriously. But more importantly, wherever you go in Wyoming, and I'm thinking of the Thunder Basin, Congresswoman Hageman knows it well, Secretary Perdue came out and actually took a ride through the Thunder Basin National Grassland and visited with the ranchers there because he wanted to see on the ground what was going on. You can't do windshield management. You have to look at the ground. You know that as a farmer yourself. And what's frustrating about this rule is it'll put in place all of these sort of constrictions on management. And as I mentioned before, it would inhibit our ability to be able to improve the range and to be able to sustain the range so that our sage-grouse populations could happen. You know from being from California that dead and dying material oxidizes. It doesn't produce anything except CO2. And that either happens over time or it happens in a fire.
Out on the range, there's lots of ideas in the world. We all learn from each other in farming and natural resources of all types, many businesses actually. Do you categorically dismiss perspectives because of political party affiliation?
Absolutely not.
We don't get that ability as governor. As
No.
a governor, you need to get things done and accomplished and do what's best for people, and we work on a bipartisan basis every single day.
Do you feel you're able to listen to an idea or perspective and give it merit based on its...
The diversity of that perspective helps us make better decisions. When we hear those different opinions, we make better policy decisions.
And there may be things that the governor and I don't agree on, and there may be things that a governor in Colorado and I don't agree on, but we find a way forward.
Even though you're in the same political party, you don't always agree?
Gentleman's time has expired. I'm going to have to move on to the next question. Recognize the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gosar, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Governor Noem. Good seeing you
Good to
again.
see you again.
And Governor Gordon, I am the lost sheep from Wyoming, so the oldest brother. So first, got to start with the comments from my colleague from New Mexico. She misspeaks. She said it won't. This rule will not stop oil and gas leases. It won't change a thing. Well, tell that to the Navajo Latis who saw their livelihoods and financial well-being dragged from them from one of their own indigenous Secretary of State, a Secretary of Interior. Once again, magnifying the old adage, I'm here from the federal government, I'm here to help. Run, Forrest, run. Now, I want to get back to this from a little different tact. You're very aware of the equal footing clause, I might ask, and the multiple use doctrine. And so yesterday, in a committee hearing on oversight, we had just the craziest hearing. And we had an individual talking about mercury toxicity. And little did she know that the number one adage for mercury toxicity is catastrophic wildfires. Amazing. Absolutely amazing. It shows that this dog chases its tail round and round and round and round we go and never catches it. So we're looking at those aspects and primacy. So let's get back to Arizona. Arizona is a very unique state because we were rejected by statehood the first time. And the president at that time, President Taft, who was the only president to go on to serve at the Supreme Court, actually forced the federal doctrine on Arizona. But he also said that the commitment was the multiple use doctrine would be very advantageous, not only for the state of Arizona, but for the federal government in utilizing it. Now, we may not have as much gas and energy that you guys have, but we're loaded with minerals. We're loaded. So this is a further attempt to victimize the West, not to empower them. But I keep coming back to that equal footing clause that states that what eastern states got, we were entitled to without this federal doctrine. I'm going to ask you, if we were to return that equal footing clause to primacy, how would that affect your states? And how would they run more efficiently? Governor Noem, we'll go with you first.
It'd be a game changer for us specifically. It would right the ship and give us an opportunity to at least be treated in a manner which gave us equal opportunity to succeed. It's not the federal government's job to come in and make sure that we succeed or to put their thumb on the scales, but to give us an opportunity to at least produce and succeed as every other state gets the opportunity to.
Gordon?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congressman, I knew your dad. I know many of your siblings, and I know your county.
Don't hold it against me.
I won't. I know your county very well, and the example you give in Sublet, where you were raised, is absolutely critical. As you know, former Commissioner Joel Bausman has worked on trying to get primacy for that area, which has national forest, has BLM, has federal leasing involved, and it would be, to the good governor of South Dakota's comment, a game changer. Really, states know how to do this. We have done it better than anyone else on sage grouse habitat in your very, your home county, Sublet, and it really is thanks to state government, not the federal government, that we got a recipe that protects the wildlife, allows for energy development, and makes sure that the communities of Pinedale, Big Piney, and others have families that can live there and make a reasonable living.
Yeah. So I'm one of these people that gets tired of playing defensive politics. And so I'm going to highlight a program called SNFLMA, the Southern Nevada Land Exchange Project. It was by the late Harry Reid. And what he found was that Las Vegas was surrounded by BLM. He couldn't grow anymore. So what he dug up is that he found in the inventory of federal laws that the government had to get rid of land they had no use for, or it didn't have a direct aspect for. And voila, Vegas grew. BLM sold land right and left. Maybe we ought to be looking at that law. If it was good enough for Harry Reid, it should be good enough for us as states and the supremacy of the state over its jurisdiction. Mr. Chairman, I yield back and I thank the witnesses for attending today.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Puerto Rico, Ms. Gonzalez-Colon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both governors for being here. Happy to see Governor Noem.
Good to see you
We were
again,
here
too.
together when I actually arrived here in Congress. And I'm listening to you both in terms of that experience, and my main concern will be how, if in any way, the management engagement from BLM was done with your state. I mean, was there any engagement before the publication of the rule?
Not with our office or with our state specifically, no. There was an opportunity to listen and gather some information at one time. I would say it's a very different, well, it's happened, Waters of the U.S. was proposed much the same way. The 30 by 30 rule, which is absolutely a land grab by the federal government that's now being rebranded and brought forward. We're starting to see this as a pattern coming out of this administration.
You were saying in your testimony and in your statement that the proposed rule will also impact in a negative way public safety in your state. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, it's going to risk people's lives because it will not allow us to manage the Black Hills National Forest and Forest Service lands throughout that area in a way that protects our communities and homes that are there. We've seen devastating fires in the area, and because it's such a populated forest, if we do not manage it, it will increase that risk of wildfire and we will lose people. So the rule completely ignores that aspect and doesn't do no analysis on what public safety ramifications may happen if they follow through on it.
You know that I represent Puerto Rico in Congress, and we don't have the Bureau of the Land Management back home.
Right.
but I think it's important to know what kind of repercussions could be in the whole nation if we don't pay attention to these. So why the general public and nationwide should be concerned about the way this rule is being imposed?
Well, it'll have long-lasting effects as far as precedent that it is setting for how every other rule is done. That's what I see consistently coming from the government, is once you allow them to overstep federal law or to trample on our states' rights, they will continue to do so. And they'll reference back to, well, we've already used this mechanism before under a rule through BLM, and they will continue to push it. So that's why it's important to stop this, because specifically on this rule, there is no scientific data. There's no analysis. They've purposely declared it rule so they don't have to provide for you what the economic impact could be on the country. And for us specifically, it is our way of life. It's the people that live there and make a living off the land.
And let me also just, if I may, Mr. Chairman, Congresswoman, here's a direct impact. Governor Noem talked about forests, and we've seen that in California, we've seen that in Wyoming, we've seen that in Montana, really everywhere across the West. The other thing we have seen, and I'll point to Colorado a few years ago, where a massive grass fire overwhelmed communities. If we aren't able to treat invasive species on our federal estate, there's a grass called cheatgrass, there's another one called Japanese brome. Both of them grow under really rapid conditions. They're annual grasses, and they are like gasoline. In fact, they're characterized as being able to change the ecology of an area. So if we're not able to treat that, and a spark hits that land, and a wind comes up, you will have devastation that can wipe out communities. We've seen it in Colorado. Governor Noem, Rapid City on the western edge, had real problems, and none of that was taken into effect. In fact, earlier today I said one of the things that this administration could do to get off their butt and actually do something about conservation is make sure that we get Rejuvra okayed. Ag Department says it's okay, EPA says it's okay. Bureau of Land Management can't figure this out. That is one of the most important things they could do for conservation.
And I need to agree with you. You said a few minutes ago that Secretary Perdue visited Wyoming to see what's going on real life there. He did the same thing in Puerto Rico after the hurricanes. So that's the kind of politics we should be pushing from our executive branch. So I want to say thank you, both of you. Thank you for the conservation you do, and your people do in your lands, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. I now recognize myself for questions, and again, want to thank both of you for coming here today and spending your valuable time with us. And Governor Noem, in your testimony, you talked about how this rule has no scientific basis. You talked about how the administration's classifying it as a minor rule, and we held up the 88-page minor rule that they're proposing. And I know a few years ago, I was out in Wyoming and South Dakota, and in the Black Hills area, and I was there on a very sad day. It was a day that one of the mills in South Dakota closed, one of the few mills remaining out there, and wasn't planning to meet with you, Governor Noem, but there was a forest fire that very day, and you had to fly over to be there for the forest fire. And I will say that some things do change. Probably since you've been on the committee, we actually passed out 2 bipartisan pieces of forestry legislation this week, one of them with a 39-0 vote, and it was on Good Neighbor Authority, which I know you worked on when you were here in Congress. And that bill had passed the Ag Committee 51-0. So we're starting to wake up and realize the benefits of forest management. This will allow tribes to do some of the same work, tribes and counties to do the same work that that states are able to do. But when I was there, I reviewed a report, and I've got a forestry background that was written not just by bureaucrats, but retired bureaucrats from the Forest Service on how the forest should be managed. And it was offensive to me from a scientific standpoint, and the basis. There was no science or knowledge that went into it. It was purely a biased report written to influence how the forest was going to be managed. So it didn't appear to be a great day in the Black Hills with a mill closing down, a forest fire raging, and a new withdrawal from, if you will, from the Forest Service on land. But you mentioned that Good Neighbor Authority is working and things are happening better in the Black Hills. So I know both of you, you utilize the Good Neighbor Authority. Can you talk about how that and other programs that are run by the state can actually make conservation better and make our federal lands better?
Well, in the Black Hills, we've utilized Good Neighbor Authority to cooperate with other layers of government, with the state, with counties, with outside associations, and we've run incredible projects that have allowed us to go out and manage the forest to make sure that we were considering all aspects of what a successful forest looks like. That's the kind of rules and suggestions and regulations that I believe we should be focusing on in Congress to cut strings rather than to tie more onto us, to allow us the freedom to look at what specifically is happening in each situation and adapt to that. That was used very successfully for us to defeat and push back the pine beetle epidemic that we were dealing with at that time that was making the Black Hills so dangerous. And it worked overwhelmingly. Since then, we've seen more and more regulation coming in, specifically the GTR that was put forward by the Forest Service that cut our cubic cord feet was pretty devastating for us to see that it wasn't built on anything on the ground. And that's what is another aspect that's impacting the Black Hills right now, why we're seeing our mills being threatened and our timber industry struggling. I know Governor Gordon's been deeply involved in this as well, as we've been trying to brainstorm and how we can keep the economy going. It's so interesting to me that we import a lot of our lumber from Canada while we have excess lumber here that we just don't allow ourselves to utilize to help support our country. And now we have lumber from California from burned out wildfires that's being shipped all the way to South
I
Dakota
know
to
that
our
was,
two mills.
I almost
Doesn't make
passed
any
out when I
sense.
heard the solution was to ship in lumber from
Well, it's
logs.
actually, they're actually doing it a little
Logs from
bit.
California, add all that freight. Think of the carbon emissions on that.
I absolutely-
To get out your, Governor Gordon?
Well, and Mr. Chairman, I mean, it's, the lesson's well learned in that particular instance. That's because the mill industry in the Northwest is dead. You know, we put it out of business. And so in order to take care of those logs, we had to figure out a way at enormous cost, both carbon and to the taxpayer, to get those logs to South Dakota, just to get them taken care of. Good Neighbor Authority has worked. It's incredibly valuable. We're working on it, obviously in the Black Hills, but also in the western part of our state. And I will point out one other thing that's really critical about this is we look at the Colorado River and the challenges it's had over the last several years. If we don't manage our watersheds well, we will compound our problems with droughts. We will compound our water shortage issues. So, and Mr. Chairman, as a forester, you know very well that when somebody says we're going to take this offline, we're not going to manage the forest, succession doesn't stop. You end up with, you know, post-successional forests that are tinderboxes. You end up with all kinds of strange things that happen. Management happens when we actually have the ability to do something.
And the point I would like to make as we wrap up this panel is that when we choose not to manage, we make a management decision. And if the federal government, the bureaucracy in the federal government is truly concerned about conservation, then let the people who know how to do conservation actually do conservation. Because the federal government's track record on conservation is really pretty poor. If you look at it compared to tribal governments, to state governments, and to private, you're looking at two different areas and actually two different universes. So thank you to the witnesses for being here today. And Governor Gordon, you mentioned something that a great point. When these trees burn, they're releasing carbon dioxide. When they fall down and deteriorate over time, it's actually methane. They release CH4 from the digestion from the bugs that are eating them. So it's you can burn it up as CO2 or let it rot and create CH4, or you can utilize those products and create good jobs in rural economies. But again, thank you both for being here today. And That's the last questions we have for panel 2. Some members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses that we will ask to respond in writing. And we will now move on to our third panel. And while the clerk resets the witness table, I'll remind the witnesses that under committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. I'd also like to remind our witnesses of the timing lights, which will turn red at the end of your 5-minute statement, and to please remember to turn on your microphone. And as with the second panel, I will allow witnesses to testify before member questioning. Okay. At this point, I would have liked to have introduced the Bureau of Land Management Director, Tracy Stone Manning, to testify on H.R. 3397, a bill with explicit actions for the director to take. However, the director declined her invitation to testify, and instead we have Principal Deputy Director Nada Wolf Culver. Principal Deputy Director Culver, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Westerman, Ranking Member Grijalva, and members of the committee, I'm Nada Wolf Culver, the Bureau of Land Management's Principal Deputy Director. I appreciate the opportunity to express the BLM's concerns regarding H.R. 3397, which would deprive the BLM of critical tools necessary to manage for the challenges facing public lands today. The BLM opposes the bill. I also appreciate the opportunity to be here on a panel with my fellow Colorado residents. And I'm also thankful to get to speak at this hearing today, to get a chance to reiterate the intent and the content of the rule, how it works, consistent with the day-to-day management of our public lands. On behalf of the American people, the BLM manages approximately 245 million acres of public land, primarily in 12 western states, as well as 700 million subsurface acres. Congress provided clear direction to the BLM in the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, or FLPMA, to manage public lands for multiple use and sustained yield, specifically to manage for uses such as renewable and conventional energy development, livestock grazing, timber production, fish and wildlife habitat, recreation, and conservation, including protecting cultural and historic resources, watersheds, and scenery. FLPMA also directs the BLM to, quote, take into account the long-term needs of future generations. Today, public lands are under severe stress from increasingly frequent and intense wildfires, historic drought, an influx of invasive species, and changing conditions on the ground driven by climate change. Simultaneously, public lands are under pressure from ever-increasing types and amounts of use. Simply put, the BLM's ability to continue to manage for the multiple uses outlined in FLPMA, which are a vital economic driver for communities across the West, depends on the resilience, the health of America's public lands. The proposed rule would help provide necessary direction to public land managers to work towards resilient, healthy landscapes that can support the full breadth of multiple use, now and into the future. Recognizing that not every use can always occur on every acre, the BLM is working to ensure the appropriate balance of uses within the multiple use framework on every acre. Conservation, defined in the proposed rule as protection and restoration, is a part of this balance, and as one type of multiple use, supports the continued resilience of the public lands. The proposed rule would direct land managers to identify intact landscapes and degraded landscapes, and consider whether and how land health, habitat, clean air, clean water can be maintained or improved or restored as necessary. At the same time, the proposed rule would direct the use of the best available science and data, including indigenous knowledge in decision-making. The proposed rule also outlines a tool to support restoration and to offset the impacts of development, conservation leasing. With conservation leases, the BLM could leverage private investment towards restoration and mitigation efforts taking place on public lands, while working with partners, industry, and the public to site energy development and to conserve greater sage-grouse and wildlife habitat. The BLM received feedback from states, localities, and developers that such a tool is necessary to support durable lands restoration and mitigation on public lands to offset the impacts of development. The rule is responding to that input. And this is an important point overall. The concepts and the direction in this proposed rule arise out of years of the BLM's experience in implementing FLPMA and working with public land users on the ground. They have been discussed and implemented internally and externally. This proposed rule reflects the lessons learned, the needs identified, and the continuing conversations the BLM has with so many partners across this country who depend on the resources of our public lands. The BLM is currently in the process of receiving feedback on this proposed rule. The rule was published in the Federal Register on April 3rd, opening a 75-day public comment period. To date, the BLM has hosted 5 informational sessions and provided numerous briefings to a wide range of the interested public around the West and around the rest of the country. The BLM has received nearly 120,000 comments thus far. While our public outreach has been robust, in response to several requests, including from members of this committee, today we are announcing an additional 15 days for public comment, bringing the comment period to 90 days. We will consider the valuable input we have received and continue to receive to inform the final rule. I'm optimistic that this rule would help achieve our shared goals discussed by everyone here today to continue to manage public lands so they can support the multiple uses that we rely on now, while also maintaining the health of the lands for future generations. Every day, the BLM seeks a careful balancing across many uses and resources to steward the public lands for all. The proposed rule would help guide balanced management in a manner that does not elevate one use over others. The BLM would continue to permit multiple uses on the public lands, and conservation will remain compatible with many other uses. Thank you again for the opportunity to present this testimony, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Principal Deputy Director Culver. I now recognize Ms. Kathy Chandler Henry, Board Chair of the Eagle County Board of Commissioners, to testify for 5 minutes. Commissioner Chandler Henry, you are now recognized.
Good morning, Chairman Westerman, Ranking Member Grijalva, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity today to testify in opposition to H.R. 3397 and to express my support for the BLM's proposed public lands rule. I was lucky to grow up in the small town of Eagle in the central mountains of Colorado. Spending time on my family's ranch and exploring the mountains and surrounding areas instilled in me an ethic to protect these places. Eagle County has grown since I was a kid. Our surrounding public lands, ranching heritage, and beautiful mountains make Eagle County a uniquely desirable place to visit, to call home, raise a family, ski, hike, raft, hunt, or fish. But our public lands are challenged by the impacts of changing climate, continued population growth, and increased demands on our natural resources. We must balance these demands with protecting our mountain ecosystems. The proposed public lands rule helps with this balancing act by clarifying the ability of BLM to consider conservation values when developing resource management plans, to manage for resilient ecosystems, and to promote collaboration among public land users. Over 80% of Eagle County's nearly 1.1 million acres is public lands. Eagle County is home to portions of the White River National Forest, which is the most visited forest in the nation, more visitors than Yellowstone, Yosemite, Grand Canyon, and Rocky Mountain National Park combined. Eagle County is also home to the BLM's Castle Peak and Bull Gulch Wilderness Study areas. About 250,000 acres in Eagle County is managed by the BLM. Like the rest of Colorado, where only 16% of BLM's 8.3 million acres are durably protected, most of these lands in Eagle County are not permanently conserved. These public lands contribute to our world-class outdoor recreation experiences and help ensure that our local economy thrives. Tourism and outdoor recreation account for roughly 50% of Eagle County's annual revenues. Maintaining our proud ranching history alongside tourism and ski resorts can be seen throughout the county with numerous grazing allotments on both BLM and Forest Service lands. I'd like to applaud the BLM for creating a new tool, conservation leases, as part of the proposed rule. These leases would be temporary, allowing local groups to work with BLM on restoration projects or renewable energy companies to enter into leases for compensatory mitigation. This is a very promising and complementary tool to support landscapes across my county and around the West. Clarification in the proposed rule that appropriately balances conservation values with other types of land practices will allow the BLM to create management plans that benefit rural economies like ours. The proposed rule further establishes a guiding principle that BLM manage for resiliency in public lands through protection of intact native landscapes and restoration of degraded landscapes. Eagle County is a headwaters county. Our community members rely on public lands not only for their quality of life and wildlife habitat, but also to provide our communities with safe drinking water. Water from Eagle County flows into the mighty Colorado River, and it helps provide water for drinking, agriculture, power, and industry for 40 million people downstream. Maintaining healthy watersheds that can be resilient in the face of drought and fire is a priority for our county, and we believe the proposed rule will assist in that resilience. The management of public lands has a significant impact on our local communities. Having a federal land management partner with clear direction to work with us on balancing multiple uses, including conservation, will only strengthen the collaboration we already rely on and will provide our communities with more certainty that our needs will be considered in BLM's planning and land management decisions. If enacted, H.R. 3397 would undermine BLM's ability to ensure conservation of critical public lands. The bill would prevent local managers from working with communities like ours to protect important recreation and conservation areas that are vital to our economies and ways of life. In conclusion, I support the BLM's proposed public lands rule. It will empower the agency to deliver on its multiple use mandate by placing conservation values on par with other uses on our public lands. As climate change, energy development, recreation, and tourism pressures continue to grow, this rule will promote ecosystem resilience. Clarification of BLM's multi-use approach and providing tools to collaborate with all users is the best method of managing these public lands that we so dearly love. Thank you so much for your consideration.
Thank you, Commissioner Chandler Henry. I now recognize Ms. Kathleen Sagama, the President of the Western Energy Alliance. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
All right. Sorry about that. You'd think I know how to operate this by now, huh? You know, I really am glad that we have 15 more days to comment on the rule. I'm very glad to hear that, Deputy Director. But I think this rule is so nebulous and it raises so many different questions that I don't think it should have been put out as a proposed rule. I think it should have been put out as a request for information or an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, because there are so many nebulous concepts in this rule. I don't see how BLM goes through this comment period, even the extended comment period, and comes out with a rule that can really withstand legal challenge. There are so many concepts that BLM has redefined within this rule that Congress simply had defined already in FLTMA. So we have conservation leases, which were not contemplated by NEPA. We have conservation being elevated to a principal use on par with the principal uses that are very clearly defined in FLTMA. So while BLM would like to change what FLTMA says, Congress is the only one who can change FLTMA. And right now, you know, you look at what are the principal uses. They're specifically livestock grazing, mineral exploration and production, fish and wildlife management and development, recreation and timber. Now, conservation is a goal. It is not a use. And so were Congress to want to change that, they certainly could, but BLM simply does not have the authority to redefine FLPMA. I mean, with this rule, BLM is really attempting to give itself power to set broad questions of policy that Congress simply did not give it. You know, BLM had its chance, specifically with FLPMA, to set wilderness study areas. It did so, it reported to Congress on that, I believe in the early 90s. It seems that BLM now wants to use areas of critical environmental concern in a wilderness study area-like manner. It seems to want to replay out history, and Congress gave it its chance. So BLM really needs to stay within the boundaries that Congress gave it, and if BLM doesn't like those boundaries, if members of this committee, who mostly are not here, want to change that, they need to do the hard work of changing the law. So we don't see how this rule comes out in a way that will stand really the test of not only time, but of any kind of legal challenge. It seems to be that BLM is just defining itself new powers. I think the governors did such a great job of talking about all that was wrong with the rule, and I know we're kind of long on time here, so I don't need to use my full time for that. I would just echo many of the things they would say, and I'm particularly concerned with how BLM has redefined terms that it simply doesn't have the ability to do. So appreciate the ability to be here today. We really call on BLM to rescind this rule, and we certainly support HR 3397. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sagama, and thank you to all the witnesses. We'll now move to questions. And for the first round of questions, I recognize the gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. Boebert, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today, especially from Eagle County. Thank you. Principal Deputy Director Culver, nearly 50% of my district is federal lands, and more than 90% of the BLM's 245 million acres are located in western rural communities. Consequently, this rule will negatively impact rural America significantly more than urban areas. Why did BLM hold its in-person meeting off to brief the public on this rule in Denver, away from where most rural stakeholders actually are?
Thanks for the question, Congresswoman. I'm really glad to get the opportunity, as someone who was at all of the public information sessions, as well as some additional briefings we've been doing, to let you know that
I am short on time, so I just would like to know why it was held in Denver.
We
away from the rural
identified,
stakeholders.
we held 3 information sessions in 3 areas where we felt a lot of people would be able to attend, and we saw that.
Where were those areas? Where were all 3 of them?
Our 3 in-person information sessions were held in Denver, Colorado, Albuquerque, New Mexico, and Reno, Nevada.
Right.
And
so Denver's a very urban area, and my rural area in Colorado's 3rd district, half of the state of Colorado nearly, is impacted the most by this, and you chose to have that meeting in person in Denver rather than on the western slope or southwest Colorado. Now, just this week, I heard from one of my constituents who is a farmer and rancher in Mesa County that this unconstitutional rule could prevent her livestock from grazing on BLM land where they currently graze and where she has an active permit. Ranchers and farmers across the West still do not have clear answers as to what the impact of this rule will be on their current grazing leases, or what happens when they are up for renewal even. We heard from one of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle today that other multi-use activities won't be harmed, but let me ask you this, will this rule lock up more land and prevent other multiple use activities under the guise of conservation?
No, it will not, Congresswoman.
There will be no additional land held up, locked up, and no multiple use will be prevented from this rule. That is your promise to my constituents and everyone
BLM
who would be
implements
impacted.
multiple use management on every acre of public land as prescribed in FLIPMA.
Since the rule was proposed with little to no stakeholder input, there are over 86,000 submitted public comments from a wide range of stakeholders who have a lot of questions. I want to dive into some of those that have been sent to me. What law passed by Congress has given the BLM the authority to propose this rule? Because it sure seems like the BLM is trying to rewrite FLIPMA here and has no authorization from Congress for this rule, similarly to what we heard Ms. Sagama speak to.
We are implementing the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, including our authority to implement for multiple use and sustainable.
Do you feel that the BLM is defining new powers through this FLIPMA and through this rule?
We are following FLIPMA and Congress's direction to manage for multiple use.
So we heard concerns earlier from both Governor Noem and Governor Gordon about this rule and how it will prevent active forest management, which is a very big issue, especially in my district. We've had 4 of the largest wildfires in our recorded history in my district, and it will lead to more wildfires. Is active forest management, including mechanical thinning, consistent with the BLM's definition of conservation in this proposed rule?
Absolutely.
You will allow mechanical thinning to continue?
BLM manages every acre under our multiple use mandate, and restoration in many places includes that kind of active
Let
management.
the record show that this rule will not affect mechanical thinning and the management, the active management of our forests. I want the record to show that you have promised that. Because in what we're seeing, what we're hearing, the questions that are coming up, this looks like a huge threat to forest management. Is this rule an attempt to further the administration's 30 by 30 agenda?
I just at least want to finish answering your last question. Active forest management is part of restoration, so different tools are appropriate in different places. So I did just want to finish my sentence since you want to make sure we have the record clear.
Well, I was asking if mechanical thinning would be impacted. Would it be reduced
So,
and
and then in
restricted?
terms of the agenda, I think certain aspects of different management could certainly be considered conservation that would support the American
Okay,
Beetle
I
Coalition.
just wanted to answer my last question that I had asked previously. My time has expired. Is this an attempt to further the administration's 30 by 30 agenda and eventually go into the 50 by 50 agenda that we hear so much of?
This is the BLM implementing its multiple use and sustained yield mission under the Federal Land Policy and Management Act to do that so that we can continue to support all the uses.
So you want to
that
further
we're
the
talking about
administration's
today.
30 by 30 agenda to lock up 30% of America's lands and waters by 2030?
This
Thank you,
rule
my
will
time
not-
has expired.
this
Thank
rule
you.
will not lock
Gentlelady's
up
time has
America's-
expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Alaska, Ms. Well, we thought it was New Mexico, but it seems to be some debate here.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Peltola, you're recognized.
Thank you. I just wanted to see if Mrs. Wolf Culver would like to answer any of the previous questions in more detail.
Thank you so much for that opportunity. I really appreciate the opportunity to reiterate that the way we've defined conservation in this rule is to include both restoration and protection. Those are active uses under the Federal Land Policy and Management Act. It's part of the specifics direction we have from Congress and is some of our additional policy right now. So we see active restoration as a vital part of managing our federal lands, and we're very grateful for the funding that Congress has given us to do even more restoration of our public lands. Thank you.
Okay, and I am sensitive about the issue that Representative Boebert brought up about rural people not having access to public comment. And I'm just wondering if you can explain how remote people in Colorado were able to make comment, although the hearing was in Denver.
Certainly, thank you for the opportunity. We did have 2 virtual listening sessions. Recordings are posted online along with all the slides, frequently asked questions documents, a user's guide, and numerous fact sheets. We wanted to provide that support in as many places as possible. In those information sessions, we did have quite a few people from different states who came, which was wonderful to see. We had Coloradans in Albuquerque, we had Wyomingites in Colorado and in Denver, we had Californians in Nevada. At the same time, our BLM leaders around the West have been meeting with their local communities. So I know that our Colorado State Director spent most of the last week in Western Colorado meeting with the counties, CCI, with Colorado Cattlemen, similar in Wyoming, in Arizona, all around the West. So we are trying to give every opportunity for people to ask questions and then to submit comments.
Okay, that is really good news. And I just want to, I really appreciate the virtual forums, the Zooms and things like that, the Teams meetings. I just want to put a plug in for Americans who don't have access to broadband internet or Wi-Fi. There are many, many Americans, certainly across Alaska and across the United States, who either can't afford it or there just isn't stable and quality internet to stay connected, especially on a visual platform. A lot of times when people have their videos on, you just drop off. And one of the frustrations I've had is the state agencies and the federal agencies who say, go to our website, look at our website. And some of them are challenging to navigate, and you have to have internet to be able to even get onto the website. So I just, I was very sensitive to her concerns about rural and remote people being able to be part of the public process, and I appreciate your answer for the ways that you were able to be inclusive. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Gentlelady yields back, and regarding the comment period, I do appreciate the wink and a nod on 15 days, even though we requested in our letter 75 days. I still think 15 days is totally unacceptable, especially when you think about people having to travel from different states to come to one of those hearings or to do it online where they may not have access. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. LaMalfa, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, 15 days, you might not even find out about the 15 days until most of it's gone by. I find that 75, typically these numbers are 60, 90, or 180, round numbers like that. That all said, under the BLM rule, there's the thought that this could require any use or permitted activity to be offset by a separate conservation lease. That's a concern. Can you comment? Is that a scenario where, let's say, somebody is seeking a grazing lease or timber, any kind of permitted activity? Would they be required then to, do you see a scenario where a separate conservation lease could be required of this person, and then will it cost them money in order to have a lease for a conservation area? And I'm sorry, I'm directing that to Principal Deputy Director Culver, please. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity. And if I'm not answering all of it, I'm sure you'll follow up with me. The idea with the conservation leases is it's one way that an entity who's carrying out a permitted activity on public lands that results in an unavoidable impact to public lands could mitigate, could offset that. It doesn't require that every activity be offset. That generally happens on a case-by-case basis. As with the rest of this rule, it's a framework for if you're seeking to offset activity impacts that occur on public lands, one option would be to do that offset on public lands, and one tool could be a conservation lease.
So that's a scenario where let's say I'm seeking a grazing lease. It could be determined I might have to offset that with a conservation lease, and I will have to pay for this lease? Pardon?
Thanks for clarifying the question. Yeah. No, right now we continue to manage grazing under the Taylor Grazing Act and our current grazing policy. This rule wouldn't affect that.
Okay, that's just an example. How about a timber operation where you have mechanical devices and such?
Similarly, the requirements for compensatory mitigation happening so far on BLM lands have happened in the context of mining, where we are trying to avoid, we have regulations requiring that, and also when we're working with states. So as noted here, we work very closely with states We manage the habitat and they manage the wildlife. Often these states require mitigation for loss of wildlife habitat that may be happening for a permitted activity on BLM land.
So it sounds like you might be deferring to states on that. There's also a question here that these conservation lease could be part of a tool or a requirement to have carbon offset credits. Now, are we looking at activities, permitted activity, possibly being required to have carbon offsets to do them?
The rule doesn't contemplate implementing that kind of requirement. One of the questions that we wanted to get input on from the public is, should we be defining the types of permitted uses more specifically for conservation leases? Should we be permitting use of them for carbon offset credits? Again, like the compensatory mitigation issue you raised, those requirements would be coming from a separate agreement or project or from a state policy.
A great amount of effort is being made on this whole carbon content situation. Do you know what the percent of our atmosphere actually is carbon dioxide?
Not off the top of my head.
Pardon?
Not off the top of my head, sir.
Okay, well, I'll give you the number. It's 0.04% of our atmosphere. Not some much higher number that your average person on the street thinks it's anywhere from 20 to 50 with all the advertising out there. It's 0.04%. In 1960, it was 0.03. So what we're talking about is over this period of time, a change of 1/100th of 1% in carbon is what everybody is getting hysterical about. And this is going to be so very detrimental to our country, its economy, and basically replace our economy with those of some other country in the Pacific Rim, or maybe offsetting clean American natural gas with Russian natural gas, which is known to be 40% dirtier, flowing into Europe or what have you. So I would be very cautious that we would look at carbon credits as some type of an additional offset in order to do legal and necessary permitted activities. So with that, Mr. Chairman, the time has flown by and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Oregon, Ms. Hoyle, for 5 minutes.
Sorry. I represent Oregon's 4th Congressional District, and the BLM manages 2.1 million acres of ONC lands in Western Oregon. About 800,000 of those acres are in Oregon's 4th District, and the rest are in Mr. Bentz's district. And I've spoken to this committee before about how these lands are unique, with a checkerboard ownership pattern of tribal, private, state, and federal lands. They're important to me, they're important to my district, and the ONC lands represent the vast majority of the timberlands that the BLM oversees, like well over 95%. So for over a century, the ONC lands have provided wildlife habitat, recreational opportunities, stream buffers for fish habitat, for timber harvests that are crucial to Oregon's rural economies. In fact, the ONC Act of 1937 was one of the first federal conservation laws, and it's directed that all timberlands should be managed under sustained yield so that harvest levels are in balance with forest growth. And later on, the Federal Land Policy Management Act of 1976 made sure that the BLM manages all its land for sustained yield and multiple uses. However, Section 701B of FLPMA is clear. If there are inconsistencies between FLPMA and the ONC Act shall prevail. So this brings me to my concern today. I'm confused about why the BLM's public land rule does not mention the ONC lands, and my concern is there's no mention of them, nor an acknowledgement that the ONC Act even exists, much less that it would prevail in an inconsistency. So was this an oversight, or is this an intentional change in policy? And to you, Ms. Wolf-Culver, I would like to know, and the counties I represent would like to know, they deserve to know, whether the BLM intends to implement this rule on ONC lands.
Thank you for the question. Right now, as you noted, FLPMA specifically acknowledges the Oregon and California Lands Act, and the BLM manages land in Oregon under both authorities and ensures that we comply with both of them. And our intent with this regulation is the same. We are not amending the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, nor are we seeking to change the ONC Act or the Taylor Grazing Act, for example. We currently manage in a way that complies with all of those bills, all of those laws, and we would continue to do so.
Follow-up. So what I would like to know, because again, these lands are unique, and again, my concern and the concerns of my constituents are that this is a change in policy. I would like to know if you could put that in writing in this rule, that in the case of inconsistencies of FLPMA and the ONC Land Act, that the ONC Land Act will prevail.
Certainly, and thank you for following up. Certainly, we do not intend to change the way that FLPMA defers to the ONC Act, and can certainly take into account how we might be more explicit about that in the rule, because the intent here was not to undermine that relationship between the two laws.
Just a follow-up. Thank you for saying that is not your intent, but it is important to me, it is important to my constituents, it is important to these lands that are absolutely unique, and especially as we see drought and wildfires and all of the challenges of managing multiple uses and multiple ownership of lands. It is critical that the ONC Land Act prevails. And what I would like, and I don't know, but I would guess that my colleague, Mr. Bentz, would like, certainly what my counties would like, is clarity in writing. I appreciate you saying, we'd like to see that, but what I would like to see is I would like to see that in writing explicitly in this rule.
Thank you. Understood.
Lady yield back. Lady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Fulcher, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Culver, thank you for being here. Appreciate you taking the time to do this. Where's your boss?
The director is at a meeting in Utah.
So that meeting was more important than showing up and talking about this issue in front of the Natural Resource Committee.
The director was scheduled to be in the West, meeting with all of our executive leadership team across the BLM.
Ms. Culver, on May 11th, the entire Idaho delegation sent a letter addressed to the director, and it was on this issue. And basically, it expresses concern. In fact, I think it's up on the board right now. It expresses concern about this issue. It asks for a public hearing. And it describes how devastating this rule, if implemented, is going to be on our state. And I got to tell you, being from Idaho, I'm not feeling the love here. You don't call, you don't write, don't respond, because we never got any of a response at all. Were you even aware of this letter? Ms. Culver?
Yes. We've received a lot of letters with different asks either for extensions or for us to complete the rule, to undertake this rulemaking,
Is it
et cetera.
typically your habit not to respond to those, or is it still forthcoming?
You will receive a response,
Okay,
absolutely.
thank you for that. Ms. Culver, just to point out the importance of this, 63% of my state, 62, 63% of my state's federal lands. Only state by percentage more is Nevada. Utah is right there with us, about that same percentage, but 33 million acres. 33 million. And by the way, thanks to lack of management, not climate, somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million acres a year burns up. And that's because of fuel load and because we can't touch the ground that we live on for the most part. We can't put any intelligence into the management of that. That's how significant this is to us. I think I know exactly why the director isn't here, and that's because she didn't want to answer these questions. I at least thank you for showing up. Mr. Chairman, I would like to submit for the record a copy of this letter from the Idaho delegation with your permission.
Without objection, so ordered.
Ms. Culver, have you been to Idaho before?
Yes, my mother-in-law is from Shoshone.
Have you spent any time with the stakeholders that work on that land, that live there, that attempt to operate or make a living on that land?
Yes, in my capacity at the BLM, I've not done an official tour, but yes, I have spent a lot of time.
So then you know, if you have met with these people, that a proper grazing project is conservation. That proper recreational access is conservation. That a proper thinning program or a timber managed program is conservation. So then you understand why we're concerned about making a separate category for conservation inadvertently makes it compete with other forms of conservation in conjunction with other uses. The multiple use structure has been in place for decades. And the worst problem we have in my home is not being able to execute on it. And the arrogance, quite frankly, just the flat out arrogance for the administration, for yourselves to promulgate something like this, thinking you know better than the people who live on this property, who depend on it, who work on it, who have the biggest vested interest in it and biggest investment in it, to see it prosper for years and years and generations and generations. The arrogance is unbelievable, especially when the majority of the administration, I would say, probably hasn't even been there. I'm going to just summarize. I think you get a pretty good feel where we're at, but I'm just going to summarize here. This request, I would like to have an in-person hearing in my state. The closest in-person hearing to Idaho was Reno, Nevada. Now, depending on where you are, that's a 5-hour drive minimum or a 14-hour drive maximum for my constituents, the people who are impacted the most by this. So I'm going to assume you can't answer that question now, but I want an in-person hearing, or maybe you can.
I cannot answer the question right now, but I appreciate the request.
But I am going to get a response back on this letter.
Absolutely.
I'm going to creating a category of conservation as a use makes it compete. There's significant arrogance by making this decision and imposing it on the people who live there, and conservation is an all of the above approach. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New Mexico, Ms. Leisure Fernandez, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for the testimony to all three of our witnesses. I always love it when our entire witness panel is women, because we have a lot of women in agriculture, a lot of women in ranching, a lot of women in conservation in New Mexico. And, you know, the issue about grazing is as important to us in New Mexico as it is to any of our other western states. That is a key element of our economy. It is a key element of our heritage. In New Mexico, we have been grazing sheep and cattle and now ibex and a lot of other things on our lands for centuries. Since before there was a United States, we have been grazing on those lands. So the issue, and then some of those lands were lost and taken into public land, even though they had been used in common by the people who lived there before we became part of the United States. So the issue of will the proposed rule affect existing grazing permits or leases? That is key to us. And so Deputy Director Culver, tell me what the answer is to that once again, and where can we look to find that in our rule, in the rule and in the previous regulations you've issued?
I think at the outset, I want to just re-emphasize that the rule sets out a framework. It doesn't make any decisions. Any on-the-ground decisions will be made by local land managers. I would encourage everyone to search the word local in the rule if you're looking at it online. We really emphasize that process will not change. So in terms of day-to-day decisions on managing grazing, that will not change. That will continue to be managed at the local level. The rule itself, again, doesn't change the Taylor Grazing Act. It doesn't affect any existing authorizations. In the context of conservation leasing, a conservation lease would have to be issued in a way that respects any existing permitted authorized use. So the issuance of a conservation lease would only occur over a grazing permit if those two uses were consistent.
For example, a rancher might want to enter into who already has a grazing lease, could come and work with you and decide, how can I work with the existing USDA programs to actually also restore? Because we do know that with that many hundreds of years of grazing, there is work that needs to be done. Is that right?
Yes, the BLM manages 155 million acres for grazing. We see that use as key to the success of the concepts in this rule, and in particular, conservation leasing as an opportunity for ranchers to work with the entities who may be providing funding for some of the practices that they've already are, as you noted, undertaking, but might be more formally set out in a lease and might be a source of additional income.
And this issue of being able to bring additional income in is really important, because when we look at the statistics, there are way too many ranchers and farmers who actually don't make a profit on their lands. It's consolidated. We have a lot of small holdings, so that issue is really important to them. And so what about future permits and leases? Will this affect future grazing permits and leases?
The rule itself doesn't take a position one way or another. I think what it looks at is these are certain aspects of conservation. Grazing practices can be one aspect. We're trying to set out a framework to ensure those are taken into account.
Right.
So,
and I am looking at page 19,591, where you actually do explicitly state that it's not intended to preclude uses such as grazing, mining, and recreation, and they would not disturb existing authorizations, valid existing rights, or state or tribal land use management. So you have that in there as you discuss the rule, and I think making sure that you can now point to specific places in the rule will help this clarity, because my constituents also want that clarity. The state land commissioner testified, was it last week or 2 weeks ago? And she is in favor of this process, but also wants to make sure that there is a commitment to continue to do that work with the state and the tribes. And do we have that commitment from you?
yes, I appreciate the opportunity to acknowledge that request. We've heard it. And again, what we're putting in here is what we intended the rule to say and how we expect it to work. And if it needs to be clear, that is the feedback we're looking for right now, and we're so appreciative to get it.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Chair, I would ask unanimous consent to enter into the record one letter of various that we've seen from the Office of the Governor of the Pueblo of Tesuque in opposition to H.R. 3397. It's dated June 15th, 2023.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Ladies, time's expired. The chair now recognizes Mr. Stauber for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. The Department of the Interior has told this committee that the new conservation leases created by this rule are simply a new tool for folks to offset impacts of activities on federal lands and are not a new requirement. However, given this administration has a track record of moving the goalposts left and right to their political benefit, we cannot rely on what they say. We must watch what they do. Ms. Scamma, do you believe that this rule will create a new requirement for companies to purchase conservation leases for energy projects on federal lands?
I think that is the goal, yes. And they do not have the authority to require that type of off-site mitigation.
And what kind of impact will this have on the small businesses?
Well, I think the Small Business Administration's Advocacy Office said it best in a recent letter. Yeah, this will impact small businesses. Most of our companies are independent producers, small producers with an average of 14 employees.
And I agree with you that this rule will have a significant impact on small businesses, and as it turns out, the U.S. Small Business Administration's Office of Advocacy agrees. And Mr. Chair, I ask unanimous consent for the SBA Office of Advocacy comment letter on the BLM's proposed rule sent this Tuesday to Secretary Haaland be entered into the record for today's hearing.
Without objection, so ordered.
I want to quote from that letter. Quote, "Given the rule has the potential to impact a substantial number of small businesses across various industry sectors, BLM must properly and thoroughly consider these impacts and modify the proposed RFA analysis accordingly." Ms. Culver, the Department of the Interior determined that the proposed rule will not have a significant economic effect on substantial number of small entities under the Regulatory Flexibility Act. But you failed to conduct an initial regulatory flexibility analysis or even provide the factual basis for certifying that small businesses won't be impacted. Why did you refuse to analyze this rule's impact on our small businesses?
I appreciate the question. When we looked at the economic analysis that we created as part of this rule, we looked at
Did you create that yourself or with the small businesses?
It was done by experts within the BLM.
Okay, and not small businesses that may be affected, is that correct?
The BLM prepared an economic analysis as part of the rule.
Ma'am, my question was, you didn't talk to small businesses that could be affected by this? You just said no.
No, it was prepared by an expert at the BLM.
So just want to, you didn't consult with small businesses. That is correct.
In preparing the rule.
Does your department not care about small businesses and their successes, which are the engine and innovators of our economy?
I couldn't agree more that our public lands are a key to supporting the success of so many small businesses around the West and around the country. We really value those partnerships and the support they provide.
Why didn't you include the small businesses in your decision?
I'm not quite sure what you're asking. However, I think we prepared the economic analysis, the evaluation of significance, working with the Office of Information and Regulatory Analysis, the Office of Management and Budget, the Department of the Interior, Council on Environmental Quality, and all of those agencies that provide that direction to us.
That's the same Department of Interior that banned mining in northeastern Minnesota for political reasons only? That's the Interior Department you're talking about. As I just noted, the SBA's Office of Advocacy has called foul on you for failing to conduct this analysis and has called on the BLM to, quote, "provide a supplemental document with an initial Regulatory Flexibility Act analysis that includes a discussion of the impacted small entities. What, if any, of the impacts those small entities may face, and what regulatory alternatives the agency considered?" Yes or no, will you commit right now to fulfilling the Office of Advocacy's request?
I need to review their request and look at what's in the rule because we did complete the required analysis. So I really look forward to reading that comment.
Mr. Chairman, this administration has continually failed to consider small businesses and their reckless regulatory onslaught. I appreciate you holding this hearing today to allow us to conduct oversight on this rulemaking, and I look forward to working with you and the Committee on Small Business to stand up for small businesses across this country, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes gentlelady from California, Ms. Kamlager-Dove, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And, I just have to say that the whiplash you get in this committee is unbelievable. Last panel, the governor, both of them, complained about how this rule takes away public input, and they got an amen corner from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. But last week, we had a committee hearing, and the committee balked at the need for public input as it relates to mining and its impact. So I guess it just depends on who the public is. So Deputy Director Culver, I want to know more about ACES and how it integrates with the needs of and coincides with respect for tribal communities. And Mr. Chair, I ask unanimous consent to enter 2 resolutions into the hearing record. One is from the National Congress of American Indians, outlining how ACES can elevate tribal traditional knowledge and protect tribal traditional cultural resources. And the second is by the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians, identifying new pathways for designating conservation areas that protect and prevent irreparable damage to important historic, cultural, or scenic values, fish and wildlife resources, or other natural systems of processes.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to enter it into the record, and I'm asking you this question because I've actually heard from some of my colleagues that they know what's best when it comes to tribes. They either appropriate or discredit viewpoints of Indigenous peoples based on, I guess, political points they want to score. But folks have actually said that there's no need for meaningful consultation. There's actually no need for consultation by Indigenous communities, which I find outrageous, and it actually strikes me quite often as, settler colonialist rhetoric, which makes all of my hair stand up on the top of my head. So A, do you believe that we should be speaking for tribes without including them into these processes and discussions?
Thank you for the question. Your hair looks great.
Thank you.
And also, this administration from day one has committed to ensure that we are engaging in meaningful consultation with tribes, and not just in a pro forma way, but a proactive way to ensure additional engagement. That's why we've committed to co-stewardship and have really led the way at the Department of the Interior on that issue.
Thank you, because as we've heard, people actually want to feel included in discussions, including tribal communities that don't want other folks speaking for them. So can you go a little deeper in terms of how this proposed rule incorporates requests from tribes and Indigenous communities, and sort of what co-management, co-stewardship actually looks and feels like and should in a non-appropriated way?
Thank you for the
Long
opportunity to
questions,
talk
I
about
know.
this.
I'm feeling it today.
One of the aspects of this rule that we are very proud of is that it explicitly incorporates requirements to evaluate Indigenous knowledge as part of the best available science that we are taking into account in decision-making. We also explicitly emphasize the importance of consulting and working with tribes when we are doing land use planning, where we allocate lands for different management. And in the context of areas of critical environmental concern, we received numerous letters and the resolutions also that you mentioned from tribes asking that we formalize the process for identifying and protecting and designating those areas to be managed. It's one tool the BLM has. It's required under the Federal Land Policy and Management Act for us to use it, to prioritize its use, and it explicitly considers historic and cultural resources. So what we've done in this regulation is note the importance of evaluating whether an ACEC could be designated. It's another acronym here at the BLM, whether we would use that and to look at proposals from tribes and to consider opportunities for co-stewardship. And what that could look like is how we incorporate Indigenous knowledge into the management decisions, or how we might work together, for example, to ensure that there's adequate education about the resources for which that area was designated.
Thank you for that explanation and response. I was having some discussions with some different tribal communities, and when I was sharing what I was hearing in this committee and how I was questioning if they felt that they were being silenced, they said, keep asking questions about this issue, because it is important that we are seen and valued in these discussions. And so with that, I want to thank you for your responses, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Montana, Mr. Rosendale, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that. Ms. Culver, as I sit here and listen to all this, as much as you would try to deny it, what I see and what I read, and the reality is the BLM trying to expand its powers, an attempt to expand your powers. And the fact that no hearings have been held in the areas where the impacted land is located demonstrates, quite frankly, the complete disregard that the agency has for the opinion of the people that are going to be impacted by it the most. Holding a hearing in an intensely urban area instead of out in the field where the people that are going to be impacted, the people that are actually managing those lands now, nowhere near them, is an insult, quite frankly. The Montana delegation also sent a letter out to Department of Interior and to BLM and trying to obtain a hearing to be held in the areas that were going to be impacted. And again, nothing. We sent that back on May the 11th. This rule completely contradicts the Taylor Grazing Act and FLTMA. It does contradict it. And the Supreme Court has recently ruled in agency overreach, West Virginia versus EPA, and now you've heard it from Congress that you're getting outside of the lines. So please, save money, save time, save aggravation for the people across this nation to have to go through that legal process to show that this is out of line, and simply stay in your lane, okay? We make the laws. Stay in your lane. That's where we need to stay. Ms. Gamma, we've heard navigating through conflicts is not something that the BLM excels at. Can you give us some examples in your experience where the BLM failed to mitigate conflict and how it's affected your members?
I'm not sure I can think of a specific example right off the top of my head, but in general, when you look at the definition of conservation leases, you can't help but see that the way it's defined in the proposed rule, it's going to preclude productive uses. So I don't see how there isn't an inherent conflict with that, and I think you're absolutely right that that Congress simply hasn't given BLM the power to redefine away FLTMA terms.
Thank you. Do you believe that this rule, would it be enacted in any way, provides more clarity about how the lands can be used or how they should be managed, or does it produce more ambiguity and subjectivity?
I think it's really nebulous at this point with this proposed rule, which is why we've joined with Public Lands Council, the Cattlemen's Beef Association, American Mining and Exploration Association, Safari Club International, and others asking that this rule be pulled back, or at least go through another iteration of comments once BLM has a chance to react to everything that they're given in this comment period, because there's just too many new terms and too many questions raised.
Thank you so much. And if the rule would take effect, do you believe it would result in better or worse outcomes for the environment and the land quality, and why?
Well, again, I think it's so nebulous how this is intended and how it would be actually used that I don't know what would come out of this. And that's why I think BLM needs to do another round of public comment and explain itself better.
And would your definition of public comment include areas that are actually where the lands are located so that the people that are in the field managing them might be included?
I do agree, indeed, that this should be out in rural areas, because it's really rural areas where this is most impacted.
Thank you so much. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Grijalva, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner, let me ask you a question. Before I descended into this position, ascended, I was a county commissioner, chair of my local county board, and there's a mythology that goes on about this is the West, and this is the West that it's always been, and this is the West that it will continue to be. The West has changed. The dynamics are different. And at least in my county, we had to deal with habitat restoration, land, and a conservation plan in order to deal with endangered species, deal with land use decisions. And those are all difficult and done at the local level. But at the end of the day, it was in response to guidance. It was in response to a law, a federal law, and the end result was benefit. more assurity about what zoning was, a conservation ethic that got strengthened in terms of protection of areas, and no grazing rights were lost. No mining operation in the Silver Bell Mountains was closed. Dire consequences did not hit my county of Pima. In fact, it is highly supported and seen as something important. My question about mythology is, you've heard back and forth today. This rule provides an opportunity for local communities to look at restoration and conservation as a legitimate use of BLM lands. That's all it does. It doesn't change the fundamental ground that we're working with, but it provides an opportunity for the future, and I think more importantly, and the word doesn't get used enough, the restoration of areas that need to be restored. Mining industry left messes all over the West that nobody talks about. No restoration, no remediation, taxpayer having to carry that burden. Here's an opportunity. Could you speak to what it means to local people to have this opportunity, and why a kind of twist of mythology that doesn't exist can't help us going into this century and dealing with issues like climate?
Great, thank you so much for that very perceptive question, Congressman Grijalva. And you've really hit the nail on the head. In our county, we really rely on collaboration. We rely on working with our federal land managers. Our small businesses are based on outdoor recreation and tourism. Our small businesses rely on conservation values, and they rely on the certainty that this proposed rule would implement to look at those conservation uses on par with every other use. In our county, we have to pay businesses to come in and take the timber out for our forest restoration programs. It is not a big money maker for us. Oil and gas is negligible. Our extractive industry is tourism, outdoor recreation. We're a rural area. We work hand in glove with our ranchers and our conservationists. The conservation district is run by our ranchers. It works with our open space, and we work closely with BLM to make all that work.
Deputy Director, this either or no proposition that we're seeing here today, either it is no rule because the freedom and fundamental life of our nation is at stake in this rule. Talk about restoration. Talk about the new players that hasn't been talked about in this part of the discussion, because restoration is a use. And the way this is being interpreted is that restoration for many communities and conservation is an important element that we're adding to the portfolio about what BLM should be doing. I don't want to repeat the 1872 law of mining where we get to do nothing but give mining everything they want. This rule gives the public, regardless of where you live, you own part of this public land, each individual in this country. And the response has to be landscape. It can't be short-term, parochial, with collateral damage being okay here, but conservation being important somewhere else. Please.
We really intentionally defined the conservation aspects of this rule as including both restoration and protection, considering those both very active uses. We've received, as I mentioned before, a lot of funding recently from Congress for restoration. We see that as something that this rule can really help us implement. Our public lands will benefit from this type of restoration, whether it's making them more resilient for fire or drought or addressing impacts of other development. And the intent of this rule, the way it's structured, the actual words of it are, it is a structure, it is a framework. And what we're ensuring is that one element of conservation, restoration, is taken into account in decision makings, looking for those opportunities, identifying the best places to do that. And the rule is very explicit that we do that with our partners, as we always do.
Yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Bentz, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank all of the witnesses for their patience. My questions are directed to Principal Deputy Director Culver. And I just want a little background. My district in Oregon is larger than the entire state of Washington. I think we have somewhere around 72,000 square miles of space in my district. And of that, about 50 million acres is public land. Exactly how much is BLM and how much is forest, I couldn't tell you, but there's a lot more BLM than forest. So this rule has a great importance to me and to the people I represent. I'm looking at your Bureau of Land Management 43 CFR Part 1600 to 6100 that was published in Federal Register on April 3rd. And looking, I think, about the 4th page. And it would suggest that there is a gap in your regulations. You agree with that, of course, because it says so right here in your document, right? I'm reading it. This proposed rule is intended to address this gap in the Bureau's regulations. What is that gap?
Thank you for the question, Congressman Bentz. The reference there is the lack of explicit regulations discussing this particular aspect of the multiple use and sustained yield.
I think you better carry that a little further because I've been studying this the entire time I've been sitting here trying to figure it out, and I want you to tell me what it actually means. Because the way I read it, you can tell me if I'm right or wrong, but the way I read it, it suggests that you're now going to take conservation as it's never defined, by the way, in here, so I'm not sure what it is. I did dig up a definition of it. It's fairly broad. The act of protecting the Earth's natural resources for current and future generations. That's the National Geographic Society's definition. Is that yours?
In the rule, we define conservation as maintaining resilient functioning ecosystems by protecting or restoring natural habitats and ecological functions.
Actually, are you reading that out of your BLM U.S. Department of Interior manual H-4180? Is that where you're getting that?
I'm reading it out of section 6101.4 of the proposed regulations. Sir.
It's suggested in this article by Michael Blum out of my law school faculty guy. BLM defines rangeland health as the degree to which the integrity of the soil and ecological processes of rangeland ecosystems are sustained. Are you trying to change the standard that currently is in your manuals with this rule? I think you are, but you can tell me. You have to be. There's a gap. You're filling it, so you have to be changing it, right?
We are providing additional detail on how to carry out this work, and if we need to update manuals and guidance.
Oh, stop. Additional detail.
Yeah.
You're filling a gap with something, so you're saying it's not changing anything? This is just additional detail of something that already exists? Is that your argument?
We're setting out a framework of how to explicitly address these two aspects of conservation, protection and restoration, with specific tools and processes in the regulation. The gap in part refers to the fact that this is a portion of our regulations that was reserved for additional regulation, and the BLM promulgates new regulations as we see the need for more direction.
Okay, then at least you do agree these are additional regulations and there will be additional work to be done across the entire scope of your activities as a bureau. Is that correct? Because that's exactly what it says here on the 4th page. The proposed rule recognizes the BLM has 3 primary ways to manage resilient public lands, and then it walks down through how the proposed rule would require the BLM to plan for and consider conservation as a use on par with all other uses, and identify the practices and ensure conservation actions are effective in building resilient public lands. And then it goes on to say that you currently can't apply some of these standards, but you're going to start doing so. Actually, it says they're applicable to grazing now, but you want to extend that applicability to other activities on public land. I mean, it's in your rules, so am I correct there? That's a new step on your part.
The rule would apply the land health standards that currently apply specifically to grazing, consideration of grazing, make that explicit to apply to other uses. We've heard for a long time from the grazing community that they comply with these fundamentals of land health, and that should be explicitly applied to other uses of the public lands.
I have to hop back to the ONC lands because indeed, as Congresswoman Hoyle suggested, there needs to be much clarity in the rule. And I think she was trying to ask what the letter they sent to you, one of the county commissioners from one of the counties that has a lot of this type of land in it. Conservation as a use cannot be applied to ONC timberlands. Is that correct?
The way we've defined conservation in the regulations includes restoration, which is certainly something that we do in compliance with the ONC Act. So we would apply this regulation in a way that complies with the Oregon and California Lands Act. For sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it would be easy to forget that we are talking about public lands that belong to the people of the United States. If you're listening into this hearing, where so many questions and speeches seem to suggest that these public lands should simply be available to various extracting industries for commercial purposes, and that they should continue to have the type of impunity that they have had for decades. But I think that the BLM public lands rule is on the right track. I don't think it's wildly controversial at all. BLM has been in the conservation business for a long time and has done all kinds of rulemakings and policy guidance for every type of extractive industry that operates on BLM lands, but never for conservation. So I would say it's about time. And I want to just enter into the record 2 letters that Congresswoman DeGette and I have sent on this matter. One is from February of this year, signed by 40 representatives in support of this rule, and another from earlier this week, where we co-led a letter with Senator Martin Heinrich of New Mexico, outlining the positives that we see in this common sense step reflected in the proposed rule. We had 45 representatives and senators sign that letter. So, Mr. Chairman, without objection, I hope we would like to enter that into the record.
So ordered.
Thank you. Now, Deputy Director Culver, is it correct that congressional intent for the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, FLPMA, is to include conservation as part of BLM's multiple use mandate?
Thank you for the question. Absolutely, it is. The definition of multiple use is very clear. It includes, for example, natural, scenic, scientific, and historical values. Those are certainly aspects of conservation, as are management of habitat. And I think the quote that I've read a few times lately comes from the former governor of Idaho, Andrus. Mr. Andrus, who was the Secretary of the Interior when FLPMA passed in 1976, and he talked about the importance of these public lands for all Americans and said in response to the passage of FLPMA, conservation is no longer a pious ideal, it is an element of our survival. I take that as something that, you know, maybe we should have gotten around to these regulations earlier, as you note, but I take that to reiterate that that was the intention at the time of the passage.
And is it fair to say that over the years you have done a lot of rulemaking when it comes to mining and grazing and oil and gas activities on our federal public lands and other commercial uses?
We do have standalone regulations for all of those activities, as well as for rights-of-way. And when we saw the need, we updated our regulations to address renewable energy, wind and solar explicitly. We just issued updated regulations on that today.
But you've never done a rulemaking for conservation?
We have not.
So that does not seem radical. It seems long overdue and sensible. Putting it on equal footing, and let's just establish that. You're not putting a thumb on the scale for conservation and elevating it over other uses in your multiple use portfolio, are you?
We're not, and the rule is explicit that this is one of the multiple uses.
Thank you. So the bill before us today would not only close the door to you taking this step, it would lock the door, and it would prevent you from doing other regulatory actions in this space. How would that tie your hands in your ability to carry out your multiple use mandate under FLPMA?
Thank you for that question, for pointing that out, that there may be unintended consequences or intended of such a law, because the rule itself actually reiterates numerous policies and activities that are already underway. For example, compensatory mitigation, restoration, planning ahead for managing to restore habitat, working with our partners to identify the best places to manage for healthy public lands and to manage for restoration. As I mentioned in my testimony, the ideas and the concepts and the tools in this rule and this proposed rule grow out of activities and ideas that are already underway at the BLM and have been for decades.
Thank you, Deputy Director. I just want to note as I close that that of the 245 million acres of public lands BLM manages, 90% are open for oil and gas leasing. The vast majority are open for hard rock mining. It is high time that we elevate conservation to equal footing with these other uses, and this rule seeks to do just that. I will note, Deputy Director, that I've had some solar power developers that are a little bit nervous about this rule. I think they're misinterpreting what's going on here, but it would be very important as you go forward, I think, to provide some assurance and clarity that just as this would not prevent other uses, it would certainly not stand in the way of our renewable energy goals and solar development on our public lands. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the bill sponsor for questions. Mr. Curtis, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to direct my questions to the Deputy Director, and thank you for being here and all the witnesses for your long hours that you've been here. Deputy Director, I'm from Utah. BLM manages 22.8 million acres of public land in Utah. That's 42% of our state. If you go more specifically to my district, I don't have the specific numbers for BLM, but federal lands represent about 90% of a high percentage of my district. Can you explain, given those numbers, why there were no public meetings in Utah about this rule?
Sorry, thanks for the question. We identified a number of places to hold information sessions and have again continued to provide responses and information sessions and briefings as requested.
The governor of South Dakota and Wyoming were here earlier, and they also expressed that there were no public meetings in their states with similar numbers. Do you not feel that you've missed something here by not coming to the people in these good areas and getting their input?
Having worked on a number of regulations and seen the federal government issue regulations for many years, I think we have one of the most robust outreach processes I've ever seen with the information sessions online, the information we've posted online, the information we've made available around the West, the amount of outreach going on from our state directors.
Right.
Yes.
To be clear then, you're saying states with significant impact by this rule didn't need to be heard from, and that was adequate. Is that what you're telling me?
With respect, Congressman, that is absolutely not what I'm saying.
Then help me understand why you wouldn't hold a single public meeting. I don't know about the other states in the region, but these three I know about. Why wouldn't you hold a single public meeting? Not one.
So we did not hold public meetings to receive comment. We held information sessions to provide additional information. And then we've been supplementing those with meetings held with our state directors, our districts, and our field offices, just as so many people have talked about how well they work with their local BLM, their state BLM, their districts. Those are the people who are having help us with additional
Let me get to that in a
outreach.
minute. Okay. BLM has not responded to letters my colleagues on the committee and I have sent. How can Utah ranchers, farmers, and recreationalists have their voices heard when you're not responding to our letters and you're not holding hearings? What do you want me to go back and tell them?
We've been doing briefings for anyone who asks, and we're happy to continue doing that. We are in a public comment period right now.
Good.
That's when we will respond.
I'm asking for a briefing in San Juan County.
Understood.
You willing to do that?
I will do I respond to briefings. We've been doing most of them virtually, but I'm sure we can, figure that out.
That's a yes.
I will need to confirm, but I'm sure we can find a way to continue discussions with San Juan County.
No, I want an in-person briefing in San Juan County where they're impacted by this in a dramatic way.
I understand your request. As I said, we're not holding public hearings, but we are providing additional
Are you willing to extend the comment period given the fact that so many people have not been heard from?
I am. Today, we announced the extension of the comment period by an additional 15 days.
15?
Yes, sir.
That gives you 2 weeks to get down to San Juan County. I'll meet with your scheduler immediately as soon as you're ready.
Having driven from Albuquerque to San Juan County to Salt Lake City on Monday, I think it can be done, but I hear you.
please. We would like that to happen. So I'm curious of two questions. One is, sounds like you're a little bit familiar with the geography in Utah. Can you give me an example where you feel like this rule would have made a difference in Utah in the last decade? What would it have preserved that was not preserved?
So to give an example that's from a little farther north in the state, we recently permitted the Trans-West Express transmission line. As part of that process, that line goes through a number of western states, including Utah.
And so you're saying that would not have been permitted under this
So
rule?
what happened with that was the company in its own discussions agreed to compensatory mitigation to provide funding.
I've only
And
got 30 seconds left. Let me try to make a
So
point
we
with
could
you. I
have
know,
worked
this
out,
is
we
my
could have
time.
worked.
I've got 30 seconds.
I know, I thought you wanted me to explain, I'm so sorry.
Okay, 30 seconds, right? How are you going, you have no funding in my district. You have 2 BLM agents for the entire Bears Ears area. What is your funding, how is funding going to change so that you have the resources to do this?
So most of this will be part of our ongoing standard practices, such as land use planning and permitting projects. We expect that it will be, funded in that way.
All right, I'm unfortunately out of time. Hopefully you interpret from my results that we don't feel heard, that we feel like we're doing a very good job of conservation ourselves. And I really would challenge you to point out anything where your involvement would have provided better conservation than what we've done. And I wish I could give you a chance to respond. I'm out of time. And Mr. Chairman, I yield my time.
You can respond if you would like.
I thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. The example I was going to give with the transmission line, there are millions of dollars for compensatory mitigation. If we'd had this opportunity, this rule, it would have been easier to work with local communities to propose projects and to implement those projects directly with the communities instead of going through the National Fish and Wildlife
I
Foundation.
think my question is, what would have been preserved in particular in the South that was not preserved because this rule was not in place?
So I think what we're looking at is the rule making it easier for our land
I know, but
managers
what
to
would
find
have
them.
been preserved that wasn't preserved by my locals that this law would help you do, this rule would help you do?
I think there is significant restoration opportunities in San Juan
I'm talking
County
about
that this rule could
preservation,
help.
not restoration, preservation, and you don't have the money for restoration, by the way.
We've just received a lot of funding for restoration from the Congress, and we're very grateful for that, and we look forward to directing it around your
Okay,
state.
but not a single example of what would have been preserved that wasn't preserved.
This rule is a framework. It does not make a decision to preserve something that isn't already preserved. It provides a way to use that tool.
Okay, I just want to point out that we're doing a very good job of preserving ourselves, and I'm not sure that there's anything in this rule that will do a better job of preserving in the area.
And our intent is to support those activities through the rule.
We can go on, Mr. Chairman, but I'll yield.
I thought we were canning pickles or something. We were talking about preservation. I thought it was a conservation discussion, but the chair now recognizes Mr. Gosar for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. So I want to make it perfectly clear, I'm against this rule, and so are my constituents. And that's why I'm also requesting an in-person meeting in Arizona with the BLM, with my constituents and myself. So I think that we deserve it and we demand it. So Deputy Culver, the Federal Land Policy and Management Act of Section 202C9 requires the Bureau to coordinate the proposed rule with states and local governments. This probably has been asked before, but has that occurred?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. That section actually pertains to our land use planning process, where we certainly do coordinate closely with our cooperating agencies. In terms of the rule itself, much of the input that we have received over the decades of implementing FLPMA with our partners is reflected in the rule.
So yes or no? Is that a yes or a no?
Yes, we have consulted with states and other partners over the years on the concepts in this rule.
So can you provide us with a report documenting the coordination process, including the steps you took to satisfy the criteria for coordination set forth in FLPMA and efforts to reach consistency with the state and local positions? Specifically, I would like the report to address the following 4 elements of this criteria. 1, because of the importance of the public lands to Western states and I made myself very clear in the first, or the second panel, whatever it was, and in particular, the rural areas and their economies. FLPMA Section 202C9 requires meaningful coordination by the BLM with state and local governments with respect to land use inventory, planning, and management activities. 2, in addition, FLPMA Section 202C9 authorizes the elected and appointed officials of state and local governments to furnish advice to the BLM concerning the development and revision of land use guidelines, land use rules, land use regulations for the public lands with their respective states. 3, FLPMA Section 202C9 also requires the BLM to provide state and local governments meaningful involvement in the development of BLM land use programs, land use regulations, and land use decisions for public lands. And finally, under FLPMA Section 202C9, land use plans adopted by the BLM must be consistent with state and local plans to maximize to the extent possible, unless FLPMA or any other federal law requires otherwise. Furthermore, the BLM must assist in resolving, to the extent practical, inconsistencies between the federal land use plans and the state and local government plans. Are you capable of doing that?
The rule would, at some point, I assume if the rule is finalized, it will be carried out through the land use planning process.
To be honest with you, with finalization, I think you first of all have to go through these 4 or 5 aspects. You haven't done them. And you've heard the parade of my colleagues saying, you know, you're way out in front of your skis. You know, this is the gentleman from Montana had it right. We're the people that are making the laws, not you. You're part of the enforcement aspect and implementation. And we got this all backwards, really backwards. And that's why I brought up SNFLMA, the Southern Nevada Land Exchange, that Harry Reid piloted. Because if this is what you're going to continue to do, then it should be up to the states and to the local governments to go back and attain those jurisdictions over those lands. I find this offensive. And he said, stay in your lane. I think that is the best advice I possibly can tell. And I'll be very frank with you. I think more and more states need to take the BLM and the Forest Service to court, because you're too far over the skis. You're out of your lane, and that's not right. This Constitution, this country was formulated on a real basis. And when you look at the Equal Footings Clause, you look at particularly the Arizona model in regards to Taft, that formed contracts with the states. And so it's not if you're predisposing one part of multiple use over another. It's you must use all of those. Otherwise, you're subservient back to the state. So I tell you, I'm very disappointed in what I've seen, and I hope that you will, I don't hope, I'll be looking forward to your answers. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Looks like we're down to only one person left to ask questions, and since when I'm talking, there won't be anybody to tell me I'm over time. This could go on for a while. But again, thank the witnesses for being here. And Ms. Sagama, I'm going to ask you, it's going to be a difficult question I'm going to ask you, because I'm going to ask you to maybe help me role play, and I'm going to do my best to be a rural Coloradan. You'll have to pretend with my accent. And maybe that you're out in rural Colorado, and I'm a friend, and I come up to you and I say, hey, Kathleen, I've known you for a while. You're a smart person. You follow all this stuff. I know you go to D.C. and you testify before committees, and you're really tuned in on what the federal government and the BLM is doing. I saw where they're proposing this new rule to do something with conservation, and I thought that's what their job was anyhow. I thought we spent billions of taxpayer dollars to fund agencies to take care of our land and practice conservation. What is this conservation easement thing I'm hearing about? How's it going to affect me here in Colorado?
Well, besides the fact that you really don't sound like you come from Colorado, I would have to say I think it's still pretty unclear what the intention is. We keep hearing that this is just a framework, that this is not, this is just multiple use, but Congress didn't define conservation as a multiple use. So when you look at these conservation leases, you can't help but think that it's going to preclude other uses. It's going to preclude the grazing, it's going to preclude oil and gas development, solar, wind. So at this point, it's hard to say exactly what the impact will be. But just looking at the plain language of it and hearing what it's not going to do, it makes me nervous that when they say it's not going to do this, it's not going to stop grazing, or it's not going to stop energy development, that what we're going to actually see out of the rule is the exact opposite, that it will be used to stop those primary, principal, multiple uses on federal lands, and that it will be stopped to do, it will be used to elevate conservation above other productive uses, so that it passes over that conservation, because we all do conservation on federal lands. We're always conserving, we're restoring, we're reclaiming. Oil and gas companies are always reclaiming the land and restoring it, and we do that conservation in agreement with BLM. But it's going to pass over from conservation to preservation only. We see the BLM trying to become like the National Park Service and move from its multiple use mandate to its into a preservation-only type of mandate.
So in layman's terms, they're saying it's not going to change anything, yet they need this massive rule to go into effect so they can do the job that they're already supposed to be doing?
Right. BLM already has the ability to do conservation. In fact, there are 38 million acres in the landscape conservation system that BLM manages already. So BLM clearly has been doing conservation. What we're concerned about is when they say it's not going to stop grazing, it's not going to stop leasing, it's not going to stop mining, that in fact, that is exactly what's going to happen.
And thank you for that. And that's, I think the general public, I was very confused when I saw this proposed rule come out, and I asked the same questions. Why? Why do they need this? What's the ulterior motive? And we've heard that it's not going to do anything, but I'm going to read from the letter that Mr. Stauber submitted for the record from the Small Business Administration Office of Advocacy. And this is directly from their letter. BLM has not, however, clarified within the proposed rule how conservation leases will be compatible with the other principal uses laid out in FLPMA. In at least 2 instances, mining and grazing, the proposed rule is incompatible. Without proper clarification from BLM regarding the implications of conservation leases on other uses and the inevitable incompatibility that may result, the proposed rule has the effect of placing conservation leases above other interests. This is contrary to the statutory intent outlined in FLPMA. As indicated above, BLM does not have statutory authority to create such additional uses that would make the other principal uses incompatible. According to the statutory text cited throughout this letter, Congress did not intend for land uses to be excluded on a programmatic level. So even the Small Business Administration disagrees and says that BLM is apparently doesn't know, somebody doesn't know what they're talking about within the administration. And Ms. Culver, you talked about experts in the BLM. And I know you're a political appointee. I don't think you went through Senate confirmation, but your boss did. And I know politics change, and when whoever's in the White House, their politics get to filtrate throughout the administration. But was it political staff or was it career staff that wrote this 88-page rule?
Thanks for the question, Mr. Chairman. The rule was written by career staff. We engage staff throughout, subject matter experts throughout the BLM, both headquarters and around the West.
So what would happen if the career staff said, I'm not going to write that rule?
Well, that did not happen, so I can't really speculate. We had a lot of, as I mentioned, a lot of the ideas in this rule you can see reflected in BLM land use plans and in decisions and in
The bottom line is we know that nothing would happen. that career staff, they work for the federal government. There's no repercussions for when they do their work, when they don't do their work. And we also know that who do they answer to? Who do career staff answer to?
They report generally to additional career staff.
Career staff report to career staff who are writing rules. They answer to nobody. They've never been elected. They never have to go out and face the public. They can put their own views, their own biases, whatever they want to, they can write into these rules. And guess what? After you're gone and this administration's gone, they will still be there. And they'll be the ones enforcing these rules. They'll be the ones that they have full enforcement. They also get to be the judge and the jury, because if somebody complains, there's an administrative law judge there in the agency that can rule in favor of the career bureaucrats. It's a broken system. It gets abused, and that's the big problem that I have with this, because it's totally unnecessary. If there was leadership and people were doing the right thing, we would be conserving our lands. We'd be providing access to it. But guess what? I know I'm the only one left here, but we answer to people. We answer to voters all across this country. So we're going to push back, because we don't think career bureaucrats buried in some cubicle over in some nondescript building should be determining what happens out on our federal lands. And we're just not going to allow that to happen. We may not be able to pass this law out of the House and the Senate and get the president to sign it, but the way it goes, I will be in contact with my friends over at the Appropriations Committee and have an amendment in the appropriations bill that says no appropriations shall be used to implement this rule that the BLM is proposing. It's sad it has to happen that way, but at the end of the day, we do control the purse strings. They may still have their job, but it'll be against the law if we are able to pass this in appropriations. And it's too bad we can't actually work on these things, and you all have hearings in all the states, that you respond to questions in letters that I write, that letters not just the House writes, but senators write as well. And we get to the point where it's the elected representatives facing off against the unelected bureaucrats. And as administrations change, unfortunately, the career bureaucrats don't. So with that, I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. I do have some things for the record. Ask unanimous consent that the following 9 letters from 93 different organizations representing a wide variety of stakeholders, including those involved in grazing, forest management, recreation, conservation, and energy and mineral development, be added to the record for today's hearing. Each letter details different concerns and expresses support for H.R. 3397 or opposition to the BLM proposed rule. These groups include the American Forest Resources Council, Public Lands Council, American Farm Bureau Federation, National Mining Association, Independent Petroleum Association of America, National Stone, Sand, and Gravel Association, and America Outdoors Association. And without objection, so ordered. Again, thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Members of the committee may have some additional questions for our witnesses, and we will ask that they respond to these in writing. Under Committee Rule 3, members of the committee must submit questions to the committee clerk by 5 p.m. on Wednesday, June 21st, 2023. The hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there is no further business, without objection, the Committee on Natural Resources stands adjourned.